Welcome to our change chat, excuse me, session today on the subject of why people resist change. So for you, those that don't know me, I'm Fraser Collins. I look after the business development and partnerships side of things here at Trueman Change, and I am joined today by Lucy, who is our founder of Trueman Change and Organisational Psychologist, who many of you are probably aware of and have met with and maybe listened to before. Lucy spends most of her time helping organisations navigate change, and more often than not, explaining to me, people like me, what's actually going on and beneath the surface. So working closely with leadership teams across councils, going through all types of transformation. If anyone understands the realities of organisational resistance in that context, it's probably Lucy. So that's the reason for our subject today. We're seeing a lot of, I guess, topics and chat around resistance to change, so we thought we'd go with that today. So instead of making it a presentation type format, Lucy and I thought we'd make it a wee bit more of a conversational type format. So we'll put Lucy on the spot for the next 45 minutes. I've got a lot of questions to ask, and I would encourage you to please ask questions as well, and ask some of the questions certainly that I'll be asking around that I hear a lot about organisations going through change and experiencing resistance. So quick bit of housekeeping. As you always know, we like these sessions to be really informal and interactive. If you've got any questions, please do drop them in the chat, or feel free to put your hand up. We'll stop with about 10-15 minutes to go, where you also have a chance to ask some questions at the end. We do record the sessions, so everybody who's on the chat today will receive a copy of the recording, and it's also available on our social channels and YouTube page. So, Lucy, let's jump straight in, will we? Question then, to start the conversation. We hear the word resistance. I'm sure a lot of people hear that word all the time when organisations are going through change. So when people say staff are resistant, what do you think the actual term, resistance means? What does it mean to you? What does it mean?
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. My dog is currently barking a lot in the background, so I apologise if you can hear him. I can't hear myself think. A lot of change management methodology is based on this concept of the function of change management is to stamp out all resistance. So whether you look at, Kotter's or ADKAR or Lewin's, there's lots of different change management models, and a lot of that kind of profession is set up around reducing resistance. And usually what they talk about is lots of comms, training, engagement, and those things are important. They are important for sure. But I think that when we go into change based on this assumption that resistance is a bad thing, I think that we need to challenge ourselves to that. I think resistance is often about something much deeper than the change itself. So we know from the world of organisational psychology that we have certain needs in the workplace. We have a need for a sense of autonomy. We have a need for good relationships. Our identity is quite core to us. So often resistance is not necessarily about the specific thing that we're talking about. So it might not be about the change to an IT system or a change to a way of working. It's often because those core needs feel a bit threatened. And actually, in my opinion, the way that we often do change and transformation kind of does take away a little bit of the autonomy. We do tend to do a lot of top-down, kind of approaches to change. I'm sure there'll be some colleagues on the call that are going through local government reorganisation at the moment. Very, very top-down, government-driven agenda there. Often change and transformation is as a result of needing to save money or budgetary issues, which again is quite a top-down approach to change. So we're attacking that sense of autonomy, and it's usually things like that people are resisting. The other one that I mentioned was our sense of identity. So there's lots we can talk about with identity. We have different types of identity. So, whether we identify as a wife or a husband or a parent, but in a professional sense, there are different types of professional identity. So sometimes it is profession. We identify with the profession that we are. Sometimes we identify with the employer. Sometimes we identify with the place that we support, particularly in local government. So again, when we're making changes to things that threaten people, if people feel like I am a project manager and there is a review going on that's going to change that target operating model, will I still be a project manager? So there's those things. And then the age-old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with on the call, which is that when we have needs that are in a kind of an order and a hierarchy, when things impact our sense of belonging, when things impact our sense of kind of security, so if we're going through a restructure, we don't know if we're going to get a job or not at the end of it, all of these things hit quite deep with us in our minds in the workplace. So often when we're getting resistance, it's because the change that we're driving is impacting one of those deeper needs for people. It can also be because of a lack of psychological safety, which is a very misunderstood term. So a lot of people think psychological safety is feeling happy and getting on, everybody getting on. It's actually about it being safe to challenge. So if you have an organisational culture where it's not safe to challenge, the resistance may become a very kind of passive aggressive resistance. So it might be that you're trying to make change happen, but nobody's arguing with you about it, but actually it's just not landing, it's not happening. So it comes in a lot of different forms, and I think that we can sometimes be a bit guilty of oversimplifying that. And we can, I think managers can also, it can make us feel defensive, because if you are getting quite overt resistance as opposed to that covert passive resistance I was just describing, it's really hard, like especially if it's a top-down agenda for change and you're a middle manager and you're saying, well, this is what's going to change, and you're meeting with that resistance and it's not your decision in the first place, so you're having to defend the organisation. So it can create an awful lot of noise. I was running a workshop with the council going through local government reorganisation this week, and we did talk a little bit about resistance and how sometimes that resistance can be because people are coming from a place of caring. So it's not always the enemy either, and sometimes if you can turn around your most kind of resistant people, they are the people that have that really strong sense of ethics, that strong sense of identity with the organisation. So yeah, it's a complex issue, and I think that we've been a bit guilty in the world of change management of kind of oversimplifying it and saying we must stamp it out, when actually we don't always understand exactly what it is. I don't feel like I've answered that question at all.
So
it could mean anything. That's the answer to that question. It could mean anything.
Keep it broad. No, I'm sure people recognise that. So something we see a lot, something I see a lot, when talking to councils, is that when leaders feel they've communicated really clearly and change, the change, whatever that change may be, makes sense logically, there's still quite strong pushback. So it might seem like the sensible thing to do, it might seem like it's a positive thing to do and it's all been managed properly, but there is still that pushback. Why do you think that happens? There's still the pushback.
So we've probably not communicated it as well as we think we have, is the first thing to say. And also I noticed that you used the word logic quite a few times in the framing of that question, and resistance is often a fundamentally emotional thing. So and this is really difficult in so most of the work that I do is in the public sector, which is an emotional sector. Like, people go into the public sector because they want to care about whether it's children, if they're a social worker, whether it's communities, it is an emotional, it's a values-based sector. And when we are then communicating a logical change, so we've got to do something because we've got to save money, and actually if it's impacting that sense of public service values that people have, then they will still respond in a more emotive way. The other thing is that we can have a bit of a loss aversion approach. So where we feel like services are being changed in a way where either there is going to be something to lose for us as staff, or whether it's we feel that this change is going to mean a loss of service for the people that we care about supporting, then that's where we'll get that change, that resistance. So when they feel like they can't influence it, when they feel like they've got that loss of autonomy, even if it logically makes sense, if we're not communicating in a way where we're hitting these kind of, this is why this is important, we're hitting the emotion of it, then it isn't going to land as well. There is a particular model which I use all the time, which those of you that have been to change chats before might have heard me mention before, which is cats and cheese. And that is a model which is all about our sensitivity to the possibility of risk or reward, and how we are on a bit of a spectrum with that. There are people that are particularly sensitive to risk, and there are people that are particularly sensitive to reward. That is quite an innate motivator, and it is coming from an emotional place. So what we know about that theory is, if you are particularly focused on risk, and the research around this was all done on mice and rats, so we would refer to those people as cats people, because they exposed mice to the scent of cats or cheese for risk or reward. So if you're a cats person and you're quite sensitive to risk, and somebody that isn't sensitive to risk but is quite sensitive to reward is talking to you, they are going to be saying, but think of all the good stuff that's going to happen, this could happen and this could happen. But if you're more sensitive to the risk than the reward, you're not hearing any of that. So people are speaking in completely different languages. So sometimes the way that we communicate change is we focus very much on the positive and the reward, and we don't address that, but there are some risks here, and this is what we need to take into account, this is what we need to think about. So I think that plays a massive factor for the people that are a bit more sensitive to risk. I don't think we communicate change well to those people. But also I don't think we communicate change particularly well. And actually, on reflection, we probably should have invited Georgia, our associate, our comms associate, although she's on holiday at the moment, to weigh in on this. But often when we are communicating change, we do it in a very programmatic way. So we talk about milestones and what's going to happen next, and what boards we've got, and when decisions are going to be made. We're not necessarily talking about what's really going to be different. And when people can't visualize what's really going to be different, and they can't engage with that change, then some people will lean back from that and resist it. So yeah, my advice would be, if you feel that you've communicated it really well, I would double check on that, because I think we're pretty good at communicating change in a range of different ways that are not necessarily meeting people's needs. So we've probably not communicated it that well, but also we need to be aware that this is an emotional thing, not just a logical thing, which I think for a lot of people is quite hard to grasp.
Yeah. Well, on that kind of point, if I was thinking about this before I come on the call, in general, for change, we all experience change, whether that's at work or whether that's out with work, whether that's for yourselves or those around you. And I was thinking about change, I was actually just thinking about my little one who changed nursery recently, and so this is like an early age thing. And I was thinking, there's an element of natural resistance, because, wait a minute, I'm changing nursery. I've been in one place for 2.5 years. Why am I changing? And then he seems to thankfully have taken to that very well. There's others not good at all who still, having, it's a shame, being very emotional, if you like. And it just got me thinking of, is it a personality thing that, we talk about risk and reward, those that are more tend, sway to more towards the risk thinking or the reward way of thinking. My question, I guess, is is it ingrained in somebody, or is there ways in which leaders, managers can actually help people's outlook and mindset towards change, or is it just a case of maybe managing those individuals with their profile or their star sign, whatever it may be? Do you know what I mean? Is there much influence we can have as leaders and people in the workplace to work with those people to change their kind of mindset?
So it is a fairly complex thing to answer that, and So the cats and cheese is not personality. So that is about mindset. It's not about personality. In the world of psychology, personality is more stable than mindset. So mindset you can actively choose and you can switch between mindsets, which is why cats and cheese is quite a powerful tool, because it's one of those things that once people are aware of it, then they can kind of consciously step in between different mindsets, which is really powerful. In terms of personality, so I'm not a necessarily a big personality specialist, and there are a lot of psychologists, including Penny, who works for us, who does uses a lot of the personality profiling tools. But the vast majority of personality research comes from something called the Big Five, and the Big Five is basically 5 personality traits that a lot of models feel that they can, a lot of kind of profiling tools believe that they can measure. I think for me personally, the jury is still out on some of whether how measurable they are, because they do rely on a lot of self-awareness. But the Big Five character traits are, the acronym is OCEAN, so it's openness, conscientious, extrovert, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And basically, we all have various elements of those things in our personality. Now, it could be argued that if somebody has a personality that, is quite within them, it's quite fixed, and they measure highly on openness, they are more likely to be open to change. Agreeableness, it means that they are agreeable to the people around them. So that might mean that they are influenced more by the people around them. So if they were around people that were against the change, then they would be resistant. If they were around people that were open to the change, then they would probably be open. I think they're probably the two. The neuroticism one may bring in some anxiety. So that might bring in worry and fear about change. So there is some evidence that people do have fairly fixed personalities. Speaking in a practical basis, though, I think that I wouldn't get too lost in that. If Penny was here, she might disagree, because I know that she very much is a user of these tools, which I am less so. I specialise in how organisations work rather than how individuals work. But yeah, so it's possible that there is a personality trait to it. However, I think we are in the sectors that I work in, we're quite far away from doing everything we could. So if we look at it from an organisational perspective and a leadership perspective, I think if we increase our skills in engaging with people, we increase our understanding in how people respond to uncertainty, and we increase our confidence. Because the other thing I see with a lot of leaders that are perhaps less experienced is when they're operating in a field of uncertainty, what they do is they lean back from the staff and, I don't want to have to answer difficult questions that I don't know the answer to. Change by its very nature creates a level of uncertainty, and we have, differences in tolerance to that. If we've got leaders that are not doing that engagement piece and not talking to staff, even if their personality profile is that they're quite open to change, they're still going to struggle. So yeah, I think there probably is a personality element to it, but that doesn't mean that we can't do change in a way that mitigates this risk and reduces some of that resistance.
Yeah. With that in mind then, and given the amount of transformation happening across councils just now, and there's things like LGR, which is topical and relevant to people on the call today as well, but in general, what patterns of resistance do you tend to see most often in public sector organisations, councils, local authorities?
So I think that overt versus covert is quite a useful distinction. So in some places, and these might be places where there's a higher level of psychological safety, even though it doesn't feel it, particularly if you're not a very experienced manager, it will feel quite overwhelming. But where it's overt is where people are saying, I don't agree with this. That's a lot easier to deal with than where it's covert. So where it's a case of, I don't agree with this because of X, Y, Z, we've not thought this through, you can have a conversation about that. And I always say to people when they're going through some sort of change, like, we might be wrong. So sometimes we just kind of launch a big change program and we get a load of resistance because it's not a good idea. So it's important to stay humble, and it's important to listen and reflect, and when people are raising issues about something being challenging. The the covert stuff, which makes it sound very sinister, I need to think of a better word, but the more kind of passive resistance is much more difficult to handle, because what you'll see there, the behaviours you'll see there, is a meeting will happen and people will, not overtly disagree. They might not particularly comment, but then it all just feels like it falls flat. And then later on, you feel like you're wading through treacle, actually trying to get things done. Now, that can be a systemic issue, and in some organisations, the culture around governance and decision making and pace is not in a good enough place to do change, where we're not agile enough, we're not kind of making decisions quickly enough. So it could be that you're slowing yourself down through all of that machinery and that process. And I think that project and program management can be guilty sometimes of creating additional sort of barriers to change inadvertently, even though it's meant to be delivering the change. But yeah, that type of behaviour is more difficult to spot. And that's where you've really kind of got to get to a place of culture, and you've got to get to a place of persistence, because sometimes in some organisational cultures, just putting your head down and ignoring a problem means it goes away. So, I imagine most people on the call will have been through some sort of change programme that just fell flat, that was launched and a lot of money was spent and stuff happened, but it never really came to fruition. And I think that's sometimes where you see that more covert behaviour. The important thing to do in those examples is to really try and pursue that engagement, to bring those anxieties to the surface, to really try and push to get what exactly is the resistance here. Is the resistance just resisting has worked for me before and kept me safe, or is there a fundamental reason? Is there a need that we're not meeting? Is there something that we've not really understood yet?
And one thing leaders ask, and I know there's a couple of questions were brought up in sessions we've run recently with leadership teams, is how, I've heard this question a lot, how does individual, how do I know if someone is constructively challenging an idea, which is healthy, it's a healthy way to do it, there's nothing wrong with that, with someone challenging that, versus actually someone resisting the change? How can leaders tell that difference between that healthy challenge and more kind of hard resistance?
I think I think you instinctively know. I would argue it doesn't matter, because you still have to go through, if it is a healthy challenge, you've got to address that challenge. But I would also look at history. So, is the individual who's resisting, have they resisted stuff before? And get to know them, I think, is important. I remember really early on in my career, I was asked, I can't even remember what the project was now, but I was asked to do like some business process re-engineering, and I was sat in the team of people in a council who answer the phone and then help people to get the benefits that they're entitled to get. And this guy who I was like sat with, because I needed to sit with a member of staff to map the process and understand it, was incredibly resistant, to the point of almost rude. And I just stayed with him and I just persevered with it. And then when he was explaining something to me, I said, because at the time I was doing some volunteering for Age UK, like a befriender service, and he said something that I connected with that volunteering role, and I was like, I had this situation because I do this volunteering and I had to speak to somebody and advocate for them with the council, and this is what we went through. And just that sharing of that personal story, which wasn't deliberate, it was a genuine me making a connection, because I didn't know a great deal about that service area, really completely changed his behaviour towards me. And what I came to understand from that, he then became one of the biggest advocates for this change programme that I was running. And I think what he was resisting was his core sense of value was he's there to help residents, and particularly vulnerable residents that are struggling with poverty and that really need that support. And his perception of me was, this is just, some project manager, change manager person who doesn't understand this world. So in his case, that resistance was coming from quite a deep place of values. So I think it's you've got to get to a place with people where you understand. And once we were on the same page, that we both cared about that, we both cared about the same thing, and that I was trying to make things better, but without losing sight of those people that needed that help and support, the relationship changed and his behaviour towards the wider programme changed, and he actually became an advocate. So there's something about spending the time with people, and again, this is what we sometimes make the mistake of, and the traditional sort of change management approach is to put on some comms and to put on some training, and a lot of it is very one way, but actually getting to know people and engaging with people is when you start to see what some of those kind of deeper issues are that's holding them back, that are very much beneath the surface.
You obviously had that resistance well with that individual, for example.
Not on
I think
purpose, I will say.
not on
It was
purpose.
a genuine. I was thinking, oh, I spoke to somebody about this last week. It wasn't an on purpose thing, but I did learn a lot from the interaction.
So what about in the moment, right? And you know, I spoke with this before the call, I think, as well. But in the moment, you know, obviously, leaders who are going through a certain, you know, moment in time where they're maybe in meetings or they're in workshops and they're getting that unexpected, if you like, even pushback in that moment. What is the best way for them to respond there and then when
Understand.
put on the spot?
Take the time to understand, and if you feel very much put on the spot, then get out of that public environment and spend time with that person on a one-to-one basis. But you have to understand, and I will say, like, I'm painting a very rosy picture here, but there will be some people, particularly when you're going through a really large scale change and transformation, there will be some people who it isn't right for. So when organisations go through lots of change, people do leave, and that's okay. You know, we've all had careers where we've had different jobs and we've left places and moved on, so that is not an issue, and we shouldn't fight that. We shouldn't want it to happen at scale, but there is natural turnover. So some people will resist but then leave, and I think sometimes when we look at who we've got in our camp, we have a certain proportion, a small proportion of people who are very pro-change. We have a small but vociferous proportion of people that are very anti-change. And then we have our majority in the middle that are probably a little bit indifferent. When we focus heavily on the two extremes, we're missing out on the majority of people in the middle. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer because it's very, very contextual. If you were in a meeting full of people and somebody was being quite aggressive and rude about change, then you would handle that. That might be a situation where you close the meeting down. But generally speaking, make sure you understand individuals. And if you can start to be thinking as you're at the start of a change journey, who put your team into those camps. Who's going to be the people that's going to be really positive and really want this? Who's going to be the people that's going to be quite influential but will resist this? How do I get to know them? How do I make sure that I'm not in that situation? How do I make sure I engage with them so that I can understand that resistance and win them over? Some you won't win over, but also how are you going to cope with that middle bunch that could go either way? And I do think we often focus on the small minority instead of the majority of people, if that makes sense.
Really good point. Yeah. So thinking about, and this is maybe an LGR related type question, but again, relevant to everyone going through change. But we are spending a lot of time with councils going through LGR just now, and they're at different timelines, you know, of that journey. But a lot of them are now starting the kind of main change time scale, if you like, once decisions are made and people are getting their head around the next stages of this process. What would what would you advise leaders to be doing early on in the process before they launch that major change if they want to minimise the resistance later on?
So organisationally, what I would be doing is I'd be making sure that those leaders are skilled up in change and they understand what change is. So we do have a bit of a systemic problem, I think, at the moment in the public sector, where we have quite a lot of middle managers that have been promoted through, you know, technical competency. So whether they're a planner or a social worker or whatever that is, so they've spent a lot of time and effort and training in learning their technical skill set, but then they're not necessarily taught how to lead change. and that is very different. So even if they've had some manager development, what they'll often be focused on there is stability, consistency, making sure that we deliver results, making sure we manage risk, making sure we manage budgets. It's that kind of it's that kind of operational level. When we then say to these people, right, you're now going to have to go through a big change and it's going to impact you personally, and because often it does, and particularly with LGR, that impacts, more senior you are, the more likely you are to be impacted personally. And we don't necessarily give people the skills to be able to handle uncertainty, to be resilient, and that's a personal skill, without thinking then about how they engage with the staff. So the first thing I'd be doing in that situation is making sure that those managers have that safe space to develop those skills and learn a bit more about how we cope during uncertainty, how we cope when we're going through change. Then, in terms of what I'd be doing with the staff, is I'd be doing really large-scale staff engagement, and whether that's understanding the culture of the organisation. So we do a form of staff engagement, which is our culture review, where we run workshops and we're doing like in-depth conversations about culture to get a sense of change readiness, so that we're helping organisations then make that assessment of, okay, are our staff ready to go through this level of change? But also lots of, wherever possible, co-production, co-design, two-way, genuine, meaningful engagement. So what we don't want is a top-down, this is what's happening, here's an intranet page with some FAQs on, crack on. What we want is conversation, because people that are feeling anxious about change, that conversation will help. People that are feeling like they're uncertain in terms of what's going to happen, even if you can't literally provide the certainty, still being able to talk it through with somebody helps. And also, particularly for LGR, meeting future potential colleagues, working in partnership with other councils, if it's an internal change, getting teams together from different parts of the council that are working on this problem together. A lot of the resistance we have is when we don't know who people are. We don't have relationships. We've got 3 core needs in the workplace, and that's a sense of autonomy, to feel like we're good at our job, and to have good relationships with our colleagues.
You
Get
mentioned
people talking to each other. I'm conscious as well, we need questions from the audience, so please do feel free. I don't know if we've invited that, but please do feel free to raise your hand or pop stuff in the chat. We're very
please
happy
do.
to take questions.
I'm running out of questions. Please do feel free to ask instead of listening to my voice. You mentioned middle managers, Lucy, as well. You mentioned middle managers there. Now we spend a lot of time with middle manager kind of levels, and some of the the sessions and the support that we provide to councils, because they are very much in the middle. They're caught in the middle when significant change is happening, aren't they? They've got pressure to deliver their day-to-day deliverables. They've got pressure maybe from those above. They've got their own uncertainty and anxieties over their own situation. What advice would you give them specifically who are kind of caught in the middle during a change programme?
So middle managers have a really, really tough job, because they often don't necessarily have the level of autonomy that they would like at a strategic level. And they're having to be that bridge between the strategic needs of the organisation, but also the delivery and the operations of the organisation. And I actually heard somebody give a really good distinction of the difference between strategy and operations last week, and I can't remember the exact. It was to do with symptoms and causes. So when you're at an operational level, you're working on the symptoms and you're problem solving the symptoms. But when you are at a strategic level, you need to be looking at the kind of causes. So that's where you're taking a step out of the day-to-day and looking a bit more long-term. It's very difficult to bridge those two worlds. And often at a senior level, people don't have that connection with the front line, and they are, driving quite big strategic change without necessarily the in-depth understanding and knowledge of what needs to happen on the ground. And so as a middle manager, you are tied in between those two audiences. And you're often in a position where you're having to kind of defend decisions that were made by people in a different part of the organisation to you. So that can be very challenging. What I would say is that be aware of those different mindsets. So I read a really good book, which is actually for business owners, and I can't remember what it's called now, but there was this concept, and it marries up with another concept in psychology and therapy, where you almost create these different personas in your mind, where you think about, okay, where am I acting in a strategic capacity? So the business owner one was, where am I being an entrepreneur, which is where am I, like, you know, kind of going out there looking for business and developing offers. Where am I being a manager? So where am I thinking about budgets? Where am I managing stuff? And where am I being a worker? So where am I actually doing stuff? Where am I producing things? And I think that concept of could very easily be applied in the public sector to those middle managers. So where are you pulling yourself up to a bit more of a strategic level to do that problem solving? Where are you managing the operations of stuff? And where are you doing kind of the doing? So being conscious that those are very different mindsets is a really powerful tool, and dedicating actual time to those mindsets is really powerful. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is really know your staff. So as individuals, really know your staff. Get really good at predicting who's going to struggle with this, who's not going to struggle with this, where are there going to be flare-ups, how am I going to manage that, predicting people's behaviour. So get good at knowing individuals, but also get really skilled up at what culture is. So culture is often a very kind of pink and fluffy term. People don't understand what it is. There's a couple of definitions we go by. One is that it's how messages move around the organisation. Edgar Scheins, who's like the godfather of culture, his definition is it's about shared learning. So what is the culture of the organisation? What are the shared assumptions of people, particularly when it's coming to change? So is there a shared assumption that change is really hard and impossible? Is there a shared assumption that it's impossible to get a decision made? Is there a shared assumption that we're going to be okay because we take care of each other? Those unspoken assumptions are hugely powerful when you're going through change, and they can foster or escalate resistance if we don't quite get them right.
Okay. Couple of questions, Rich, thank you. And Julie, firstly, Rich, to what extent should ambitious middle managers be asking for change skills / looking for opportunities to practice? Could this, for example, be built into annual 6-month reviews?
So to the most extent possible. I personally, a lot of my clients at the moment are councils going through LGR, and I'm speaking to lots of people who are worried about whether they've got a job or not. And I said to a bunch of people the other day, there's not many people out there earning a good salary for dealing with situations that aren't complex and are very stable. So if you are ambitious and you want to do well, and I have this conversation in the context of doing a podcast style interview like this with a recruiter. If you want to do well, regardless of your field of expertise, if you want to do well, you are going to have to be good at change. Because when you think about the scale and pace of change now compared to what it was 20 or 30 years ago, you know, in the last 6 years alone, we've had wars, we've had massive demand changes, we've had technology really going through the roof, like with AI and so on. We've had COVID, which was fundamentally a massive urgency to make a lot of change happen very quickly. So to be a good senior leader, you absolutely need to be able to manage change well. My personal view, and this may not be popular, is that the way that we perceive, the way that change management as a methodology has developed is not good enough. So I think that it's a good starting point, but it relies on this very programmatic view. And that's because the industry of change management fell out of the industry of project management, which is a programmatic view because it was designed by engineers. It was about building bridges and putting your nuts and bolts in the right place at the right time. Whilst there's sometimes some safety and it feels comfortable to think of things like we're all going to go through this journey and it's going to happen in this order, the world of psychology tells us it's much more about deeper needs in terms of what makes people react in certain ways. But yeah, if I was an ambitious middle manager, I would be learning as much as I could about leadership, about culture, about change management, like get a really varied toolbox, learn a bit about psychology, learn a bit about people in the workplace, and then you can actually pick and choose. In terms of could it be built into 6-month or annual reviews, absolutely. I think that's probably an organisational call, but yeah, I don't think you can get very far as a senior leader if you're only focusing on business as usual and stability.
Okay. Thank you, Rich. Julie's got a question of unconscious misalignment. Julie, do you want to ask that question? Is it easier to unmute to ask it?
Yeah, sorry, I've run my there's some feedback. Is it just me exactly?
I'll mute and then see if
okay, yeah, that's better. Thank you, Lucy. So we're about to implement, or hopefully if we get the yes to a business decision at the end of March, we're going to be implementing a new enterprise resource system into our force. And whilst it's in theory, a tech-based project, because it's a new technology system, we are very aware that it's going to bring a lot of change. We're going to be adopting the new system as opposed to adapting it to suit our needs. That's the approach that we're taking. We've got people in the organisation, and all of the senior leaders are on board with the adopt, not adapt approach, and that's been fed through from the top, right through the discovery phase that we're currently just coming to the end of. But already it's playing out with the sort of the middle managers who have been part of this from day one, and we've been talking about adopt, not adapt. Now we're getting to the sort of the crucial sort of ironing out the details. There's some elements and some conversations creeping in around, but we don't do it like that. And I'm really worried about not being able to do this. This process works really well for us. I mean, it doesn't work really well. It's terrible, which is why we need a new ERP, but it's their comfort blanket. It's their safety net. It's what they know works for them. It's what allows them to sleep at night, thinking about our payroll department and the pressures that they have. So I suppose I don't know whether unconscious misalignment is the right terminology, but it's like that they say they're on board. They know we've got to adopt, not adapt, but actually they don't understand, or they're appearing not to understand the actual change element of that. So, and I've been listening to everything you've been saying about, and some, change management training would be useful, I think, for them to understand that change curve better. But I was just interested to know, I don't know whether you've been part of delivering an ERP and what tips you can give, because again, a lot of people think it is a technology-based project, and it clearly isn't. It's going to bring about a lot of change management. It's probably going to be the biggest change management or change that we've seen in force for a long time. I'll shut up. I probably rambled on a little bit there. Sorry.
Thank you. No, it was really helpful to get the context. So I'm not particularly a specialist in IT change. What you I think you're right to acknowledge that you're going to need a lot of support in terms of that change side, because one of my criticisms really of the IT world is they often do just the tech side and then expect the organisation to do the change side, and actually there's quite a big gap in between. What I would say is, and this is a really simple question that the more you think about it, the more difficult to answer it is, and that is, what will be different? And I would be really mapping out, at your point in your journey, personas of people, so different groups of people, whether that's different, positions in the force, whether that's different geography, whatever it is, like segment your audience and then ask what will be different for those people. Because often when we are talking about technology change, we talk about the technology, but we don't talk about the change. And that might be where you get in this sudden resistance, because you might be in the, this is getting real stage of that journey, where now people are starting to think, but what about this and what about that? Because we've not necessarily explored that. Well, what will be different for the person answering the phone? What will be different for the person who's, out on site? What will be different? And it's a very difficult question to answer. But I think if you can start to build that picture and engage with your people on the basis of what will be different, you then turn in the focus away from the technology and more towards the change, if that makes sense. And that then gets to your adopt rather than adapt, because when they're in that adapt mindset, they are, the technology needs to fit me. But when you're in there, well, this is what will be different in terms of how we actually operate, you're giving them a space to explore how they can make that change happen, rather than insisting that the technology, it won't be an easy journey. It won't be an easy journey, but I think if you can get to a place where you're talking about the actual differences in people's day-to-day work, that will enable you to do a really good change impact plan. It will enable you to really figure out where there are skills gaps and there might need to be training, and it'll focus more on the behaviour instead of the technology, which I think is what you probably need.
Lovely, thank you.
You're very
Does anyone
welcome.
else have any questions?
I think Rich has put another comment in. So in my experience, good leaders want to do this. They look for people to develop who aspire to get involved, but it has to be two-way. People shouldn't have to wait to be spotted. No, they shouldn't. And if I'm being brutally honest, some tough love here for leaders out there, there has never been a time where it has been easier to access good information yourself. So I think I see a real spectrum of our clients. I mean, and there's a bias there, because if they're our clients, then they're into this stuff. But in terms of how much organisations are willing to invest in this, but it ain't that expensive to get a book. It ain't that expensive to watch some. It's free to watch some YouTube videos. So I do think there's something about both of those things. You need an organisation approach to it that, you know, is investing in that training and is investing in that, giving people the experience, because it isn't just training. I think you were right to point out that people want experience as well as training. But also there's a lot of free stuff out there. So as individual leaders, I think it's always worth investing in yourself, absolutely.
Another question I had, Lucy, was without naming names or clients or anything like that, but can you share an example, like, and bring to life an example where an organisation has maybe shifted its approach to leadership or culture, and you saw the resistance turn into momentum?
Yeah, I'll just let Rich come in with his hand raised, and then I'll give it an example.
Oh, thanks, Lucy. I was just building on your. We've got a bit of an echo. There we go. Yeah, so building on your segmentation thing, something I've used a lot is when you've segmented the audience, is almost break them down into obviously the what's in it for me, and get them into a situation where you're not coming in saying, I think these are your challenges, but maybe take a couple of prompters and then get them to articulate what their challenges are, and then sort of start to work out, well, if that's your challenges as a director versus a line manager versus a user, what sort of support we can offer to work with you. And then the third box is almost about specific interventions that go back to the challenge and say, right, okay, so we've had a proper discussion about it. So it's not just a sort of template-led thing. And you might, as I say, have a couple of prompters in. These are typically problems that people in your position may face. And then the more they buy in, the more they come and articulate some of their challenges. Then you talk about support. Then you talk about specific interventions. Just a thought.
Thank you. Yeah, that's definitely a sort of coaching style of asking questions rather than dictating, which is very powerful for sure. So the question was about examples, wasn't it? So we did a piece of work where it was a housing almo that was being brought back in-house into a council. There was a huge amount of resistance there, and there was also this kind of sense of stagnancy and passiveness and disempowerment. So we tackled that by doing what we call a workforce approach to change, where it's basically a methodology around co-production. So we set up a series of little task force groups which were tackling specific things. So like one was tackling repairs, one was tackling like what the housing officers, and so it tackled different things within the service area. And we had them multidisciplinary. So they were fairly small groups. They were like less than 20 people in the groups. And we had people from different parts of the housing association and the council, so that we were creating that integration and that, you know, shared way of working. And we gave them very specific problems to solve. So like, tell us, in fact, they gave us the specific problems. Tell us how things work at the moment and how we could make things better. And they came up with a series of it started with, well, we need a new IT system. So it started with the big stuff, which the council was not in a position to be able to make happen quickly. It is happening, but things like that take a lot of years. As I'm sure Julie, who was speaking about the ERP, would say, when you're bringing in a big new system, that's not an overnight problem. But the problem that we had was that in waiting for the bigger decisions, people were very kind of paralysed and not able to make stuff happen. So what we did was we really facilitated for them to look for small changes that they could make happen. Well, if we can just change this form, if we can change who we ring with this problem, if we can just get like a little checklist together for how to deal with this situation. So they were fairly small changes, but they massively added up to quite significant value, like multiple millions, because they were all small things, but that were happening often. That was enabled us then to create this kind of workforce that were building that muscle of, okay, we've had an idea and then we've put it into action. So it was over several workshops. So the first workshop was tell us everything that's rubbish. The second workshop was come up with some ideas. The next workshop was, let's look at the data. So we were building that skill, but also that confidence around let's make improvements happen. And a year later, I saw the chief exec of the whole council who said to me, I need to understand what you've done in that area because the culture's completely shifted. So it is that engagement and that kind of getting people to do a bit of the work themselves. When you've got this them and us with management and staff, and the management are making decisions and the staff are kind of disengaged from it, that's when you create a culture where you foster that resistance. When you actually create a culture where people can say, all right, I know I can't necessarily have my big new IT system or whatever, but I can make this thing better. And then you make this thing better. By the time you get into your big new IT system, you've then got a workforce that are used to having ideas, making improvements. They're more open. So you've changed that relationship. So I would say that was one of the examples of where we've seen it through from beginning to end, and it's been really successful.
Thank you. So we are almost run out of time already, but here we are. Anyone else have any more questions at all just before we finish up? Any other points or anything? Thank you for being interactive and getting involved. I'll just extend this. No, well, Lucy, thank you. Thank you very much. Always great to hear your insight and your expertise. It's been a really interesting conversation for me personally, and I hope for everyone on the call. I think what today highlights is that, I guess, resistance can be about taking the time to understand things like culture and leadership behaviours and how people are experiencing the change, understanding individuals, which I guess makes a huge difference to how successful that change ultimately is. So thank you. Very, very, very interesting stuff. So I always say to everyone just at the end of these chats, if anyone today would like to continue the conversation with myself or Lucy around how we support organisations, so whether that's work like culture reviews we do or leadership development sessions, programmes, support, then please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I'll send a follow-up email, so you have obviously my details and with a link to the recording. I also mention as well, our next Change Chat is on the 24th of April and on the subject of why culture matters. So again, a very interesting topical subject, so please do join us for that. I'll put the link into the follow-up email as well, and I'll drop it into the chat just now very quickly. There we go, that's that done. So thank you everyone, and again thank you Lucy. I hope you all have a great rest of your Friday and weekend.